Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Carbon Pricing in Business, Government, and Higher Education. I'm pleased to see that we have very solid attendance today, including some of you from a range of business sectors with operations in Connecticut, as well as from academia and nonprofit organizations. We also have some folks beaming in from outside the state, so welcome to everyone. My name is Heather Burns, and I'm founder and CEO of the Connecticut Sustainable Business Council. CTSBC is a nonprofit organization engaging and educating a cross-sector business community in building a sustainable economy in Connecticut. This webinar is based on a live program. It's our first webinar in a series to take place over the next 12 months. In addition to carbon pricing, we'll be exploring topics such as impact investing, sustainable healthcare, water in business, and the business case for sustainable procurement. Our unique angle on these and other topics is to create relevance for business. As you will see, the format today is intended to move at a quick pace while providing you with leading edge information intended to be utilized in a manner that's helpful to you. Before I go ahead and dive in and introduce our outstanding speakers, I'd like to cover a few logistical items. First of all, the session's being recorded so that you can share or access the presentation after the conclusion of today's program. Your microphones have been set to mute and will remain muted throughout the webinar to reduce background noise. If you have a comment or question, you can move your cursor to the chat icon, scroll down to my name, and type in your message. I'll do my best to respond during the presentation. You'll see we have a very fast-paced agenda today, so we may or may not have time to answer questions following the program. We'll have to see how things move along. A little bit first about CTSBC. We were founded in 2016 as a nonprofit organization, thanks to the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, as well as our founding member companies. We've since grown over the past couple of years to include a wider range of both industry sectors, as well as size and type of company. So our first speaker today is going to be Mark Breslow. He's going to talk about, he's the Director of Public Policy and Research at Climate Exchange. He'll provide us with a dive into what carbon pricing is, what some of the models are used, and how it might be used to combat climate change. Next up is Michael Bueno. He's Climate and Energy Coordinator for the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. He will discuss some of the state-based policy efforts that are underway. Followed by Thuy Phung, who's currently working for Businesses for Social Responsibility. Thuy is a former graduate student at the Yale School of Forestry, and she was the lead program organizer for Yale's Carbon Change corporate webinar series. She will be discussing some of the trends with large global brands around internal pricing on carbon. Deb Geyer is Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety and Corporate Social Responsibility at Stanley Black & Decker, and she will talk about her company's journey to establishing an internal price on carbon. Our program will conclude with Casey Pickett, who's Director of Yale's Carbon Charge, and he will share why and how the university has adopted a price on carbon and how the model works within an academic environment. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Mark Breslow. Mark?
Can folks hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mark.
Okay, good. All right, now for some reason, we're down at the bottom of my screen, of my slides. So let's get back up to the top. Always a little bit of technical stuff. All right, title screen. First screen just for fun, wanted to show you my neighborhood. The last time we had a major rain event, I live 8 miles from the coast, but in a low-lying neighborhood. And this is what it looked like after a major rainstorm. You were actually able to kayak down my streets. So I think we're looking forward to more of this. This is the outline of what I intend to talk about today, which is a fairly broad overview of carbon pricing, but focusing below the federal level, so at the regional and state level. First, what is carbon pollution pricing? What it means is that government puts a fee or a tax, whichever you prefer to call it, on all fossil fuels based on how much carbon dioxide they release when burned. So as you know, coal, oil, diesel, natural gas all have different amounts that they release per unit of energy. You could also apply the same kind of fee to the other greenhouse gases, and some states are doing that. Then you have to decide what to do with the funds that come in from that, which is a big part of the policy design issue. You can return that money to the public and or use it for programs to reduce pollution. Why would you do carbon pricing, given that there's lots of other policies to impact greenhouse gas emissions? Well, first, for all products, you want to include the damage to society that a product causes within its price. Otherwise, society is using too much of that product. And that goes for fossil fuels or anything else that causes pollution or has other, what economists call externality effects. Second, raising the price gives both consumers of fossil fuels and energy suppliers an incentive to shift away from fossil fuels and toward greater energy efficiency and clean energy. And that's, of course, the purpose. Then there's two major types of carbon pricing that exist in the world. People on this call probably mostly know that. One is called cap and trade. The other is direct carbon fees. Both of these, in theory, can have the same impact and yield the same cut in emissions. If you do a cap, it means that you're telling everyone within your geographic area what's the total amount of CO2 that can be emitted. And then the normal system is that every large emitter has to buy a permit for each ton of CO2 that they emit. In theory, if you haven't put in any loopholes that guarantees that your geographic area is going to emit only as much CO2 as you've put into the cap. The flip side of that is that you don't know what the price will be per ton of emissions. Normally this is put to an auction and people are bid on the emissions permits called allowances. And it could be a high price or a low price, and it could be more or less than you want it to be. Cap and trade is generally easier to pass politically because government is not directly setting the price. It's setting a limit, and then in theory, the free market is setting the price so that legislators and governors and whoever else isn't as directly responsible, where voters can say, you raised my fossil fuel price by X amount. You can say, no, I didn't. It was the market that decided. You can also reframe cap and trade because the trade has gotten a bad reputation as cap and invest, which there's an attempt to do now, where the invest means we take the money and invest it in clean energy. Cap and trade does have problems with it. One of those problems is offsets, which I don't have time to get into in depth, but an offset is a way of reducing emissions by some other method outside the trading system or outside whatever type of activities being controlled. And that has caused major problems, especially in Europe, and evades the cap essentially. If you do fees instead, which my organization is mostly into promoting fees, it sets the price directly. The advantage of that is that if you know the price and you're a business, you can take that price and use it to plan your investment. You can calculate how much is it going to cost me to invest in something that will improve my energy efficiency or to spend more for clean energy. And you can calculate how much that's going to save me in paying lower CO2 fees. So you can have a reasonable cost-benefit analysis for your investment planning. With cap and trade, it's harder to do that because you don't know what the future prices will be, and in some cases they've been erratic. Another advantage that's more of a theoretical one, it's not been as dependable in practice, is that with fees, because they're more obvious to the public, the government tends to feel obligated to return more of the revenue to the public. And then that has a reinforcing effect, which is that if the public gets the money back, it's more likely to accept the idea of raising the fees in the future, which is what you need in order to reduce CO2 more. If the public doesn't get the money back, they're going to be more resistant to having the price go up. And then finally, with fees rather than cap and trade, you don't have the same potential for loopholes. So you generally don't have offsets under fees, and you don't have the potential for setting the cap too high, which is what has happened in, at least under RGGI, was done originally, although it's been reduced recently. And if you set the cap too high, then your program is ineffective. Same thing happened in Europe. So that's all the theory about this. Then I'm going to move to the actuality of what's been done so far in the United States. The first cap and trade system on CO2 was the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or known as RGGI, which went into effect in 2009, exists in 10 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. New Jersey's just rejoining it. It's only on electric power generation, not on other sectors of the economy. The RGGI cap was set too high, which meant that the allowance prices wound up being too low, and that meant that it didn't reduce emissions very much. How much it reduced them or not is a matter of debate, because there's lots of other things going on, including the big drop in natural gas prices, so that actual electric sector emissions have dropped greatly in the Northeast, but what you attribute that to is open for debate. At the same time, because we succeeded in doing what Europe didn't do, which is that instead of giving away the emissions permits initially for free, we charge the polluters for them. It did bring in money, and that money has mostly been used for energy efficiency programs, and those programs have significantly cut use of fossil fuels and therefore emissions. And finally, there's an effect that's hard to quantify, which is that the very existence of RGGI may have scared utilities and generators into changing their behavior and anticipating further regulation, so that in the Northeast especially, they started shutting down coal plants and converting to natural gas even more than they would have just based on prices by themselves. The second major system in the United States is California's cap and trade system, which went into effect more recently than RGGI, but it's broader. Besides electricity, it also covers heating fuels and motor fuels. The money goes to a combination of things, to consumer rebates, to what are called at-risk industries, which is mainly manufacturers and the petroleum industry, and a lot of it goes to clean energy investments. It's because of the size of California and because their price is higher than in RGGI, it's generating a huge amount of money that the state is able to allocate to these purposes. Another example is British Columbia, Canadian province, which started in 2008 and is the only in existence what would call a revenue neutral cap and carbon pricing policy, where they put on a fee or a tax, and they've returned all the money to the public ever since. That's made it politically popular. There's some evidence that it's reduced fuel a fair amount, although there's debate about that. And because the price hasn't been raised since 2008, the price effect is becoming smaller and smaller each year. What to do with the revenues is a big question. There's a variety of things you can do with them. and that makes a big political difference and a big difference in how this affects emissions. I'm going to focus just here on Maryland, which is the state that we worked with to design legislation that was brought up this session. And we did an analysis of what made sense in the legislation based on research studies of what their economy looked like and what their emissions look like. And every state has a different design. We've worked with several states on this. In Maryland, about 2/3 of the revenues go to households, 22.5% to employers, and 10% to investment. On the household funds, they're concentrated on low and moderate income people because we wanted to hold them harmless. The remaining household funds go equally to each adult with a half share to each child. And the employer funds are targeted specifically to vulnerable industries, including government agencies, not to all industries. This slide is one that's been very important politically in Massachusetts and Maryland and other states because legislators and the public, for good reason, are very concerned about low-income people. So what this shows is the impacts on the lowest income fifth of households in Maryland, and it shows you what the average fees per household are, the average rebates, and it shows you that the average low-income household would have a net gain of $150 per year. This is the last slide, and again for Maryland, it shows you my calculations of what are the vulnerable industries. And in general, those are industries which are manufacturing, agriculture, or other, which are vulnerable because they sell most of what they produce interstate or internationally on markets where there may not be carbon pricing in these other jurisdictions. So their prices are going to be raised while their competitors won't. You can see it's a small share of the economy and of emissions. Also, we think are vulnerable are both nonprofits and state and local government, not because they compete internationally, but because it's very difficult for them to change their prices. If they charge prices at all, they can't do much. It's hard to do that, right? It's essentially raising other taxes, which is very difficult to do. So between them, we estimate that 16% or so of emissions in Maryland, and the numbers are somewhat uncertain because the data is, are from vulnerable industries, and therefore we needed to rebate at least that much money to those industries in order to protect the economy. And I'm done. And this is how you can reach me if you want, and we're happy to help you think about policy in your state, wherever you are. Thank you.
Great, Mark. Thank you very much. Michael, I'll ask you to go ahead and take control from Mark. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, my name is Michael, and as Heather mentioned, I am the Energy and Climate Coordinator for the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. NCEL is a nonprofit organization. We're a network of 1,000+ legislators from across all 50 states. We basically work to connect people together and to basically support them as their environmental staff. So in our experience, at a glance in 2018, there were 13 states that were considering carbon pricing legislation in some form, a lot of them taking up multiple models that Mark had spoken about earlier. Utah was the first with a Republican co-sponsor. Up until now, most of the sponsorship has been particularly from the Democratic Party. You might have heard in the news a lot about Washington State's carbon tax bill. It was one to move the furthest in that it went to the Senate floor. Unfortunately, it did not make it past that, but there are a coalition of nonprofit organizations and citizen action groups within Washington State that have basically pursued a ballot initiative to implement a carbon price. So in November, a carbon tax in some form will be voted on by Washington state populace. So one of the models that we've seen in terms of carbon pricing is starting off really simply. You know, as states are trying to pursue how they can act on climate and to also balance out political and economic pressures within their states, states have gone to implement bills of which are called for study commissions, basically to investigate how a carbon tax or carbon pricing policy would impact their state economically and how that model would look like. So states that have pursued that in 2018 include New Mexico, New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont, and New Mexico passed theirs. So in the coming years, they will spool up a study commission to investigate what carbon pricing could look like in their state and hopefully progress an actual bill in the coming years. One of the other carbon pricing bills is what we refer to as revenue positive. So basically, this is where whatever tax or price that is levied on particular sectors in the economy, you accrue revenue for the state. So that can be reinvested for renewable energy deployment or distributed in other state programs or even as refunds back to citizens. So this is just one method of not only cutting back on emissions, but also ensuring that other sectors of the economy that it can actually boost, say, deployment of renewable energy and can also cut back on emissions, say, energy efficiency retrofits for housing, or even developing or instituting, say, incentives for clean and efficient transportation initiatives to cut back on emissions even further. So the states that pursued this in 2018 were Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Utah, and Washington. And in contrast to that, we have revenue neutral models. So these are pricing structures that don't accrue revenue. Instead, they basically offer rebates directly back to consumers, mostly in consumers' electric bills or as something that is provided back when you, say, receive an income tax. So they utilize this to replace either other taxes in the revenue stream, so creating tax cuts for the state, which can actually be, you know, something of politically palpable and palatable for certain people, or they use it to cover the excess costs for a carbon price. So states that have pursued this in 2018 are Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Vermont. And then you have the cap and trade model, which was discussed earlier. So currently, California is the only state in the United States that have a cap and trade system instituted. There are cap and trade regional models, such as RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that is basically a coalition of states that have gathered together to create a carbon market for emissions. Oregon has been pursuing this for the past few legislative sessions. Basically, it's where the market sets the price for carbon and you trade within that market. Unfortunately, this year, Oregon did not pass the bill, but they have implemented a coalition of basically a study committee of their own to see and hash out what policy would look like in the next session. So they felt that this session was a little too short. So they're working out to see what the policy will look like and implement it further on. One unique thing that we've seen is that as states really try to pursue carbon pricing initiatives, they have a fear that they be basically left out of a competitive, say, economically, if other states don't go along with carbon price themselves. Sorry. So in order to do that, there have been regional initiatives to basically try to pursue carbon pricing together in partnerships. And we've seen this in what we have initiated as the Carbon Cost Coalition. So it's a coalition of state legislators from 10 states that is focused on reducing carbon emissions and implementing a carbon pricing policy in their states. What this has done in sort of this coalition is to pursue effective carbon pricing measures with a set of principles that they can gather around. So reducing emissions, developing market-based solutions for climate change, ensuring equity in proposals. So when you have, say, a revenue positive carbon pricing bill, so some of that revenue can go into supporting, say, underserved communities or frontline communities that might be impacted more by climate change, or even by what the increase in cost to maybe energy or electricity could be for some. Creating resilient economies, and overall, and most importantly, is improving public health. And so as states pursue carbon pricing policy, we have seen that more people want to join in terms of doing regional efforts, so that way states can support each other and create a bigger coalition once they manage to implement these policies. And that's it for me, and that's what we've seen in the States. And you can contact me at mbueno@ncel.net.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Now we're going to transition into some business insights into this topic, beginning with Twee. Twee, we can see your screen, but we see the last slide and not in full slide mode yet.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Wonderful, we can hear you.
Great, yeah.
Can you just hit full screen mode so we
Sure.
can see the full? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's great to be part of the webinar today. Thank you so much, Heather, for inviting me. So as Heather mentioned, I work for BSR, which stands for Business for Social Responsibility now. And when I was a graduate student at Yale, I helped coordinate a webinar series. And in this webinar series, Yale partnered with the World Economic Forum and the World Bank to invite companies to share their experiences on internal carbon pricing. So today, I'm going to share with you some of the trends in corporate internal carbon pricing globally and from some of the companies that participated in our webinar series. So to start, how do I advance? Yeah, here. So this map shows the status of policy and internal carbon pricing as of October 2017. So every year, the World Bank and the CDP publish these data, and this is a map from 2017, but they will be coming out with their 2018 report soon. So in this map, the jurisdictions with existing policies, such as the European Union countries, are in gray, and in blue are the countries that have emerging carbon pricing policies. The red triangles show the number of companies in each country that currently have an internal carbon price or plan to have one in the next 2 years. And not surprisingly, the highest number of companies with internal carbon price are in Europe, given the European ETS emissions trading scheme that has been running there for over a decade now. In 2017, there was positive development in North America. So in the US, even though the federal government withdrew from the Paris Agreement and a host of other federal climate action, companies in the US reported, so there's a continued increase in the number of companies in the US that reported the use or plan to use of an internal carbon price. And there has also been significant increase in internal carbon pricing in Korea, Japan, and China. And the number is expected to increase given the rollout of the Chinese ETS, which is the largest ETS emissions trading scheme in the world. So overall, there has been tremendous growth in the use of internal carbon pricing among companies. So in 2017, over 1,300 companies reported a current or planned internal carbon price. And this is up from 150 in 2014, a remarkable increase. And companies report three main reasons that they're using the internal carbon price for. One is to manage risk. So that's to assess their risk exposure and to prepare for upcoming carbon regulations. The second is to identify opportunities, either cost cutting or new revenue generating opportunities. And the third, and which is arguably the most impactful way, is when companies use internal carbon price as a transition tool to move towards a low carbon business model. So companies in this category, they use their carbon price to align their investments with a 2-degree climate scenario. And similar to what Mark had said for public carbon pricing, companies also use the carbon price, the carbon fees to generate revenues that they then reinvest in low carbon activities to help them achieve their emissions reductions target. So in 2017, of the 600 companies that are currently having a price on carbon internally, only 189 companies are using it as a transition tool. But we are expecting this number to increase, especially with the implementation of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So now I'm going to switch to discussing the experiences of some of the companies that have taken part in our webinar series. And I've also put the Yale Carbon Charge here for comparison. Casey Pickett, who's the director of the Yale Carbon Charge, will talk more about this program later in this webinar. And so here's a summary of the approaches to carbon pricing that different companies take. In terms of the model, some companies use a shadow price, some companies use a fee, and some use a combination of both. So a shadow price is a hypothetical price on carbon that companies use in their financial models to stress test and to see if inclusion of a carbon price will impact the project economy. A fee is an actual charge to business units depending on their actual emissions or estimated emissions, carbon emissions. And most companies, they use the monies collected from the fees and put them in a central fund that they then use to fund emissions reductions activities. The Yale model, on the other hand, is a revenue neutral one where they return all of the fees to the business units, but how much each department, not business units, because it's Yale, each department will receive, how much they will receive depends on their energy performance in that year. And for the price, some companies like Mahindra and Microsoft use a lower range of $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent, whereas DSM and Unilever use a higher price of 40 to 50 euros. And some energy companies use an even higher price in the range of $100 per ton of carbon emissions. And companies have reported that the internal carbon price has helped driven changes in investments, in operations, and in behavior that help reduce emissions. Notably, of the 4 companies here, there are 3, DSM, Microsoft, and Unilever, that are part of RE100. So they commit to source 100% of their electricity from renewable energy by a certain date. And for most of the companies, the internal carbon price only covers scope 1 and 2. So that's their direct emissions in their facilities and their purchased electricity. But more and more companies are considering expanding to scope 3 emissions. So for example, DSM wants to expand its CO2 price to merger and acquisitions analysis. Mahindra and Microsoft wants to extend the CO2 price to evaluate suppliers and to help make the case for design and development of low carbon products. Unilever, on the other hand, they say that other than designing more energy efficient products, they don't really have a lot of control on how the consumers use the products once these products are in their hands. So Unilever's position is that it is more effective to have public carbon pricing. So instead of focusing on extending carbon price to scope 3 emissions, they are now focusing more of their efforts on advocating for climate policies in the countries that they operate. And here are some more examples of the positive impacts that the internal carbon price has helped generate. So for Microsoft, they say that the single most impactful element of their internal carbon price is how it's integrated in the P&L statement, the profit and loss statement. So once business leaders saw this line in the P&L statement, they started asking, what is this fee? What is carbon emissions? How do I reduce this fee burden? Because of that, it drives a lot of engagement that results in efficiency and innovation. Microsoft also uses some of their revenues from the carbon price to buy carbon offsets from developing countries, such as from avoided deforestation or clean cook stove projects. And they also use the money to fund climate grants. So in this picture is a pilot underwater data center that they had a few years ago that is cooled by ocean water and powered by ocean current. DSM said that the shadow carbon price has helped them make the upfront business case for capital projects that reduce emissions. Unilever, on the other hand, has found that the shadow price hasn't been very effective, but it still led to unexpected innovations because it forced business leaders to consider low carbon alternatives that they did not think of before. And Unilever found the internal fees to be more effective because, similar to Microsoft, they tap into the competitive spirit of businesses, and people want to find ways to do energy efficiency and renewable energy to reduce their emissions. So if you're interested in learning more about these companies and other companies that participated in the Yale webinar series, you can check out our website here. All of the video recordings and the summary blog posts are there. And the series is still ongoing. So you can sign up for the newsletter to receive notification about new webinars that will be coming in the fall of 2018 and in 2019. So thank you very much for your attention, and you can contact me at my DSR email address here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Debbie?
Hi, can you hear me in my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. As Heather mentioned, I'm Deb Geyer, and I lead the Environment, Health, Safety, and Corporate Social Responsibility function for Global Stanley Black & Decker. If you're not familiar with our company, I'll give you a brief intro. We are a globally diversified industrial leader, about 12 billion in revenue, making us the #1 in tools and storage and the #2 in commercial electronic security. We're a global company. We have about just over 57,000 employees, and we're headquartered in New Britain, Connecticut. And just this year, we're celebrating our 175th year of being in business. Some of the brands you might know from our company include Stanley Security, Porter Cable, Craftsman, DeWalt, Irwin, Bostitch, just to name a few. I'm going to walk you quickly through our past 10 years and how we have developed an internal price of carbon. And I'm going to start with the year 2008. It was at that time that we did collectively take on a concerted effort to electronically collect all our global energy footprint down to the local level. And our mission was to identify high consumption areas, which equated to obviously higher energy spend. And we would design energy efficient projects to reduce their consumption and therefore save money. And this was really our first value proposition that gained us some good credibility with our senior leadership. By 2010, we translated our energy footprint into a carbon footprint, probably very similar to what everybody does on this webinar, where you use the greenhouse gas protocols with assigned emission factors to various energy types, and you can come up with your carbon footprint. By 2012, we created visibility to our potential price of carbon using enacted or pending or proposed legislation in given jurisdictions. And let me just show you what I mean by that. This is just a small snippet from our internal, what we call our manufacturing and our distribution center scorecard, where our environmental metrics are all tracked. But specifically here, I just encircled the application of this jurisdictional carbon price to our carbon footprint at the local level. And that in turn creates our potential internal carbon price when you add up all of our locations, and there are hundreds of us, 100 of our locations out there. It was these carbon prices, or on the slide, we call it a carbon tax, that became our next value proposition, and it really opened the eyes to our senior leadership on the need to start to adjust our energy portfolio towards more renewable or low carbon energy economies. I'm going to go back to the timeline and talk about year 2013. So with our energy and our carbon efforts moving forward, it really earned us a lot of credibility internally. And it was at that time that we created our trademarked brand for sustainability at Stanley Black & Decker, and we call that EcoSmart. And you'll see this logo marquee throughout our plants, as well as starting to appear externally on some of our product packaging and our communications. By 2015, we moved from what we call incremental efficiency projects to larger scale, longer return on investment projects with an eye toward renewable energy. And these projects were funded in 2015 from the corporate office with a budget that aligned in part to our potential internal carbon price. By 2017, our businesses felt the momentum towards going with renewables, and they actually took over the funding of these EcoSmart projects. So let me just share what we had last year in terms of identified EcoSmart projects. We funded roughly 28 projects with a combined cost of just under $2 million, about 1.7 million. And that was spread across 13 countries. The majority of the projects were in Europe. You can see about 98% of the projects were definitely driven towards energy conservation and renewables, also building infrastructure and LED lighting. So closing out the timeline, by 2018, which is this year, we launched a brand new 2030 corporate social responsibility strategy, which includes our climate change commitment and our ambition to positively impact the environment through our operations. So no more incremental here, we're talking big swings going out to 2030. And let me just share with you what that means. We're extending our carbon emission reduction efforts shown in black. You can see our energy footprint or our carbon footprint. That's going all the way to carbon positive by the year 2030. As well, shown in yellow, we commit to reducing our emissions across our supply chain that's shown in yellow again, by 35% by the year 2030. So very big, very ambitious swings aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. So just closing out the timeline, just a little bit of advice is that incrementally embedding and integrating the price of carbon across Stanley Black & Decker is having and will continue to have a profound positive impact on our sustainability performance. And I encourage everyone here, if you're not currently on this journey, to join it. And thank you. I'll pass it over to Casey.
Thanks very much, Deb. Hi, everyone. This is Casey Pickett. I am just getting my PowerPoint shared here. All right. Can everyone see that? Yale?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So I run the carbon charge at Yale University, and let me see if I can get this to, sorry, hold on. Great, got it. It's a university-wide effort to apply a price on carbon to building energy consumption. So I'm going to describe briefly one of the concepts underlying the carbon charge at Yale, which is called the social cost of carbon. And then I'll talk also briefly about how it was developed at Yale and then how it works. Let's see. So this idea of the social cost of carbon is simply that since we know that climate change increases the severity of a whole host of problems, heat waves, floods, wildfires, crop decline, the spread of infectious diseases, and even some of the factors that drive violence and conflict and are driving some of the refugee crises across the planet. Since we know climate change contributes to those, and we know each of those things actually harm people's health, people's property, animals, and ecosystems, all those things have a real cost, by which I mean people actually have to pay money as a result of these things. So, for example, if your reservoir dries up, you've got to find some other way of getting water, which will often cost money. If your forest burns down, there's a whole lot of product there that's lost, to say nothing of the ecosystem and the ecosystem loss and the natural capital loss there. If your city floods, a bunch of people have to find a different way of living. That all costs money. This is also from Katrina. And so if you take all of these costs and figure out the per additional ton of carbon dioxide amount of cost that was caused, that's the idea of the social cost of carbon. How much does it cost the world to emit 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide? And when you ask the question that way, it leads to another one, which is how do we reduce emissions enough to avert these various crises? When one of the founders of the idea of the social cost of carbon, Bill Nordhaus, was asked that very question on Yale's campus in the spring of 2014, he responded by saying, well, one thing we could do is to charge ourselves for our carbon emissions, which got, I gather, I wasn't there, but I gather it got polite titters in the audience. But some students picked up on the idea, and a joint degree student at the School of Forestry and School of Management named Jennifer Milikowski pushed that idea forward, wrote a white paper on it. Her professor suggested she send it on to the Yale president, Salovey, which she did, and he and his administration, particularly the provost of Yale, were really excited about the idea. So in August of 2014, they created a task force at Yale to study the idea of implementing an internal carbon price across the university. The result of that process was a recommendation that Yale go forward and implement the a carbon price through a pilot study first. So we tried 20 buildings for 6 months. That pilot process went well enough that the provost and the president decided to go forward and roll the carbon charge across the campus. So we've now just finished the first year of the carbon charge at Yale being in effect. From July of 2017 through June of 2018, the carbon charge was in effect. It remains in effect today, but but that year is now complete. So we've been charging buildings $40 per ton of carbon dioxide that they're responsible for emitting. And here's the way the price works. So we're only targeting building energy consumption. So the charge is not applied to travel. It's not applied to purchasing, like paper or computers purchased. It's applied to a computer once you plug it into the wall somewhere, but only then. And the other particular thing about the way we've designed our carbon charge is that it's a revenue neutral approach. So it pretty closely mimics most of the proposals for national carbon taxes, where the entire amount of revenue that's generated then gets divided up and given back to those that it was charged. But it gets given back in a different way than it was charged. So there is a marginal incentive. So the mechanics here are, we have 27 different planning units. These are like business units on Yale's campus. These are the different schools, each museum, library, athletics department is a planning unit, et there are actually 49 of them across the campus, but 27 of them have building responsibility. They're responsible financially for their buildings. So for those 27 planning units, we've inserted 2 new lines into their budget. One line is called the carbon charge line. That's a negative number to them. They need to pay the carbon charge. And the other line is the carbon return line. That's a positive number to each planning unit. They will get an amount of money back. That is their return. And what they end up paying at the end of the day is the net between those 2 numbers. Everybody gets a charge. Everybody gets a return. They pay the difference. This is the money slide. This is the key one to look at. So the way that things are calculated, take the large bar on the left. That's all 259 buildings that are participating in the carbon charge at Yale. If together, I'll call that all of Yale, even though Yale has like 500 buildings. And there are just many of them that are small that we're not charging yet. Those that we're charging account for about 70% of Yale's building related emissions. So we're approaching the Pareto rule of the 80-20. So we've got energy meters on all of our buildings, and we know the historical energy consumption. So if those 259 buildings together increase by some percentage, say it's 1%, just for argument's sake in this slide, then consider 3 individual building scenarios. Building A increases its energy consumption between its baseline period and this year by the exact same percentage that Yale did. It's going to get no charge because its return and its charge numbers will be identical. So they'll net to 0. Building B increases its emissions by some greater percentage than Yale did. It's going to end up with a charge that's greater than its return, so it's going to end up having to pay money. And building C decreases its emissions or increases its emissions by less than Yale did, then it's going to end up with a return greater than its charge, and it's going to end up getting money back. So let me dive in to go in a little more detail. This is an example energy report that we send out every month. I'll be sending the final year's energy report actually later today. And I'm going to zoom in on the top 2 boxes of this report. Oh no, I'm not. Sorry. Just look at those top 2 boxes. The second line down shows current year to date. This was taken from last year around this time, July and August. And every month you just get 1 more months of data contributing to your year to date. So it shows in the second box to the right, emissions. That's tons of emissions that this building was responsible for this year to date, times $40 is the social cost of carbon, equals about $16,000. And then we take everyone's energy consumption in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide across Yale. That's about 31,000 tons as of August last year for the year, those 2 months. Skip over 2 boxes, we multiply that by $40, and then we give each building back its percentage of total Yale carbon charge. Its percentage, we give it back the percentage of the total Yale carbon charge that corresponds to the percentage of Yale energy consumption that that building was responsible for in the historical period. So if you ate, if we're dividing up the pie of Yale's carbon charge into wedges, we're going to give you a slice of pie that's based on the amount of pie that you ate in the historical period. It's not the amount of pie you ate this year. It's based on your history, so that the charge and the return are disassociated from each other, which means you can't affect your return. All you can do is affect your current charge, which gives you an incentive on the margin, and that is the incentive that you should pay attention to, of nearly $40 per ton of carbon dioxide. It means that you should focus on reducing your carbon dioxide emissions. I'm going to leave it there. Heather, shall I pass it back to you?
I think I can go ahead and grab it.
Great.
Yeah, I love this part. Okay, so that, I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to take questions today unless we could take one really, really quickly. We did have a question from a participant, and that was, is putting an internal price on carbon viable for municipalities, particularly small cities and towns? And Mark, I might direct that question to you. Do you have maybe a 1-minute answer?
Mute. There we go. So I think that the situation might be somewhat similar to a place like Yale, although most municipalities are probably tighter on money than Yale is, where, as was said, you would be giving money to each department on the basis of its historical emissions, but then giving it an extra benefit based on reducing its emissions, which means it's also reducing its fossil fuel cost and therefore the costs of the municipality. It would have to be done carefully because finances are so tight in municipal departments, but you could do it, and there are a bunch of cities and towns that are at least doing the shadow pricing version and the version in which they're specifically allocating money to the most cost-effective CO2 reducing projects and then crediting departments with implementing those.
Great, thank you. Well, this does conclude our program. I want to say thank you to all of the participants and speakers. I think as we can see, this is a growing trend. It's been underway for 10 years, and we'll probably likely see more on the topic. We'd like to encourage all of you to visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. We're going to be planning quite a few really interesting events around the state of Connecticut live, as well as continuing this webinar series. So thank you so much.